Did you ever try to invent your own language? Maybe when you were a child, a secret language for you and your friends to use that no one else could understand. Or maybe you studied languages and came to love linguistics, so you want to create your own language because it sounds like an interesting challenge. Or maybe you're even writing a book and want to create a language for a fictional community, society, race, whatever have you. Well, today I'm going to share with you a couple of tips and tricks that I personally think will create a good basis for anyone who is interested in creating their own language. In case you're new here, I'm Lana. I am an artist at heart, but a linguist by education. And I too am working on a language of my own. I've been working on it for, I think, about a couple of years now, actually. And I say working on it because creating your own constructed language, well, that's basically a lifelong process, and it's never finished. Not really, because there's an infinite amount of nouns and verbs and adverbs and adjectives that you will just never be able to really come up with. But of course, that doesn't mean that you can't create a very functional language that can still be used, that can still be spoken among people who know it. After all, every language, real language, is constantly evolving. New members, new words are constantly being added to it, and some just fall out of use for whatever reason. So if you look at it this way, every real existing language is never truly finished because it's constantly evolving. So maybe you can take some comfort in that when you are constructing your own language, and you are inevitably burdened with the fact that it will never truly be complete. So what do I think you should start with when you are constructing your own imaginary invented language? Based on, my linguistic background, but also on my practical knowledge from working on a language myself, I came to a very basic and uninteresting conclusion that a good place to start is with the outline. I know, shocking, right? As boring as it may sound, having a good plan often leads to a good result. So yes, I would advise you to ask yourself this. Why are you inventing the language? What is going to be its purpose? Is it going to be a secret language for a small group of your friends or family members? Is it going to be your own personal experiment as a hobby? Are you going to use it in a book, in a novel, for a fictional society? Well, for example, if it's the latter, you're kind of going to want to focus a lot more on the written forms, right? Because it's primarily going to be seen in the written form. And then another example, if you want it to be used for daily communication as a cute little secret language, you're probably going to want to develop the vocabulary that enables you to talk about everyday, more or less trivial things. You're not going to want to go super niche into terminology or develop some linguistic structures that are not the most necessary for communicating on a day-to-day basis. But whether your language is going to be primarily written or spoken, you should still focus and think about how you want your language to sound like. For people from non-linguistic background, I think phonetics could be the hardest topic to think about, but still I think it's a good idea to at least consider some basic things like the relationship between the phonetics, the pronunciation, and the spelling. If you, for example, had the word right in your language, if the word right was just called right, how would you write this word? Maybe like this, or like this, or even like this. Maybe in your invented language, you will decide that the spelling and pronunciation will be quite similar. Or maybe you'll be like English and you will have to have spelling bees because the spelling and the pronunciation are quite, they don't have that much in common for the most part. Look at which languages you will take inspiration from, which real languages. And that goes both for phonetics, how the language will sound, as well as for grammar. The more languages that you speak, the more interesting elements you can pull from different sources. You can say, okay, I speak these three languages, A, B, and C. Language A has the best way to form plural because it's the easiest. Let me take some inspiration from there. Oh, but language B has a really cool pronoun system or something. I don't know. You can make it as complicated or as easy as you want at the end of the day. Also consider the alphabet. Will it be the normal, aka Latin alphabet, or will you invent some letters and symbols as well? Will you invent the whole alphabet and create sort of like a runic system or something like that? Or, for example, German has the Ü, Ö, and E with the umlaut, right, with the two little dots. That's in German, but English doesn't have that. So will your language have something like that? Okay, so once you've thought about these things, you can finally start inventing some of the words. Now, the best structures to start with, in my humble opinion, are closed word classes. Why? Well, because as the name says, they are closed, meaning they have a finite number of members / words. Those would be pronouns, modal verbs, conjunctions, determiners, and prepositions. So yeah, you only have to invent a certain number of them. Unlike nouns or verbs, for example, where there will always be something that you'll remember, oh, I didn't invent a noun for that thing or for that thing or for that concept. But yeah, as a side note, how should you go about inventing nouns and verbs and sort of open word classes? Well, think about language learning. Usually you start with segments like this is the house, and these are the rooms in the house and the objects in the house. This is the human body. These are the body parts, right? Try to perhaps segment it in this kind of way. Don't have it too random. Like, oh, this is what hair is going to be called. This is what teacher is going to be called. This is what car is going to be called. Don't be too all over the place, would be my suggestion. But if we return to the closed word classes, of course, another option is you can be a rebel and say, oh, in my invented language, we're not even going to have pronouns, or we're not even going to have conjunctions. You are going to have to come up probably with alternatives to talk about things then, because the lack of these words is likely going to show. In the world, languages function in many different ways. Not every language has gendered nouns. Not every language has the dual, right? So you can absolutely skip or try to reinvent certain structures for your creation. I mean, you are the creator of your language. You can technically do whatever you want. But do keep in mind that the absence of certain forms or certain linguistic rules is probably going to show. Bottom line, closed word classes, start with those. You'll have a list of them, you'll be able to memorize them, and when you're going to be forming sentences, you're going to be halfway done with just some of the closed word classes. As for nouns and verbs, I would suggest you start with a few basic ones too, especially verbs like be, do, have. You're certainly going to need them when you're making example sentences in your language. Now you can also start gradually coming up with certain linguistic rules. I did mention this briefly before, but let me also show you an example in my language. Think about things like how the plural will be formed. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, how my language works, but basically Adam means man and Eva means woman. Yes, very creative, I know, but it's very easy to remember, very straightforward. I'm all about simplifying my language, and I also like it when it makes me laugh a little bit, when it's a little bit silly, because that's just the fun part, right? It needs to give me something back. So Adam, one man, Adama, plural, men, and Eva, woman, Evas, women. Next, for some linguistic rules, you can consider making negative and question sentences. Also just regular positive affirmative sentences, but then negative and question sentences, because you will have to think about the word order, right? And you do want to lay that out, and you want to have a rule for that, because it will help you create sentences later on with more verbs and nouns and just more words. And you will know exactly how to form a question sentence if you have a rule for it. Okay, and here's a fun one. Comparatives and superlatives. Those can be really fun to create. Big, bigger, the biggest. Small, smaller, the smallest. In my language, you add to the end for comparatives and at for superlatives. So you would have, for example, urtum, which means old. To say older, you would say urtumom. And to say the eldest or the oldest, you would say urtumat. Basically, the great thing about having linguistic rules, or for example, in the case of superlatives and comparatives, you don't have to waste time and think about, oh, how do I say I am older than my sister? No, you just need the word old, and then you immediately have older as well. Now, there are many different linguistic rules that you can come up with. Another one that I would suggest is coming up with a system for creating possessive forms. I, for example, took inspiration from English for forming possession in my language, more specifically the off phrase. To say the cat of Lana, you would say kato i Lana, or the cat of mine, kato i min. Lastly, when you go inventing your nouns and adjectives and adverbs and verbs, think about any linguistic features that these groups, word classes could have in common. For example, in my language, all the verbs end with an E. Ratte, gabe, senne, and so on. That's how you recognize the verb. And when you're inventing verbs, you also know, okay, so I need a new verb, it's gonna end with an E. And then when you have all this laid out, you can just go to town and invent all your nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs. Okay, maybe it's not as straightforward as that, but inventing your own language can be so fun and rewarding. Let me know in the comments down below if you ever tried to invent a language or if you're currently working on a constructed language. Please feel free to share your experiences and also any tips and tricks that I perhaps didn't mention in this video, but you think could be helpful. And don't forget to tune in next week for a very creative video. After the holidays, it will be back to languages as usual, but I have a little special creative something that I've been working on to end the year with. Thank you guys for watching. Take care, and I will see you very soon.